that Kepler's is. First of all, I would like to acknowledge and thank the transition team members who provided invaluable support and guidance to pull off a successful transition of Kepler's. So Steve, Beth, please stand up. Gail, Mitch, Clark. Where do we have Clark? Come to the front row, Clark. Everyone needs to see you. Gene, where's Gene? Gene needs to be, Gene wasn't on the transition team. Gene needs to be here too. And Patrick, I'm missing Patrick. So for those of you who don't know, the transition team was formed in December last year when Kepler was facing a certain shutdown due to mounting financial difficulties. And over an 8-month period, the transition team helped restructure Kepler's old debt, developed a new hybrid legal structure that Kepler is operating in now with a sister nonprofit organization. We raised money from the community to provide startup capital for the new Keplers, which is unprecedented, a second time over for Keplers, and conducted a 3-day community planning workshop in July called Future Search, which is the first time any bookstore in the world has conducted something like that. We brought together 85 people from the community to work together for 2.5 days and think about what the future of Kepler should be. It was very influential in a lot of things we're doing. So thank you for the transition team for making all that happen. Thank you. Second, I would like to acknowledge and thank the over 700 of you who have contributed money to provide startup capital for the new Keplers. So anyone who contributed money, please stand up and let us thank you and acknowledge you for what you did. We are expecting a few of our founding patrons today. I don't know, is Larry Sonsini here? Do I see him? Or Mark Horowitz? They were supposed to be here, or maybe they're going to be rolling in. Okay. You are one of a kind, Gail. We're very fortunate to have several founding patrons. These are successful serial entrepreneurs, VCs in the community, as well as a lot of regular folks. Really it was so heartwarming and just blew me away that there was so much support for Keplers and for this new vision that we created for creating the community bookstore of the future around Keplers, and the community has really trusted us to implement this vision. So thank you for all of you who donated money, who contributed money, and who helped with the various fundraising and the campaigning efforts. And lastly, but not the least, I would like to acknowledge and thank everyone else from the community who's helped. And there's so much help you've gotten. So if any of you were a community volunteer, a staff, if you helped organize the Future Search, if you participated in the Future Search, please stand up and let us acknowledge you again. Some of you will be overlapping, some of you are native, but so many of you helped us in so many different ways. Thank you. I mean, our volunteers, our staff, our publishing partners have all worked so hard. Folks from Random House and HarperCollins and PGW and others, Barrett Kohler. So many people have worked so hard and really broken ground in so many new areas. Just as an example, we have a whole new initiative here called the Kepler's Digital Labs, which is being run by Julie and Lee Monckton, who came from the community, and they've just been such wonderful supporters and volunteers, and now they're helping us figure out our future with audiobooks and ebooks. So thank you for all of that. The next person I want to bring up here is really how to say this. The story of Kepler's successful transition would not really be complete, without him. And I'm talking about Clark Kepler. It was Roy Kepler, Clark's dad, who founded this business back in 1955, and we're going to talk a whole lot about Roy today. That's the featured book for tonight's author event. But it's really Clark who has led this remarkable institution for the last 33 years. Under Clark's leadership, Kepler's grew from strength to strength, expanding its role in the community, building some wonderful new programs and partners, and winning multiple awards, nationally as well as locally. I mean, the amount of wonderful nationally recognized authors that we see coming through Kepler to give talks here is because of very strong author events programming that was built under Clark's leadership. Earlier this year, Clark decided to retire from his position as CEO of Kepler's, and in a remarkably selfless gesture, agreed to transfer the assets of Kepler Corporation into this new entity that we're hoping will become a community-owned and community-operated sustainable model for bookstores of the future. So please join me in welcoming Clark and give him a chance to make a few remarks.
Well, thank you, Praveen. I appreciate the opportunity to take a few minutes to talk about my dad and the bookstore. And it only feels just a little bit funny to be here tonight as a guest for the first time ever in this bookstore. But thank you. Thank you. Before I begin, I really just want to say, it really has been my honor the last 30-some years to guide the bookstore and to carry on the legacy that my dad started. And it's just as exciting for me to be able to pass the reins of the bookstore on to this new team and to see them carry it forward as we are doing and seeing tonight. I also want to just say thank you, and I'm really excited about the new Keplers, and I want to acknowledge all of the great work as Praveen already did, but add my voice to the incredible effort that so many people in this room and in this community did to make this evening possible, the reopening of Keplers. If you knew my dad, as some of you here may have, you would know that at the very least he was an idealist, motivated by deeply held convictions. When he opened Kepler's, a block from here, a block south on El Camino Real in the 50s, he was seeking a right livelihood in which he could support his family without compromising his values and really enable him to continue his life's passion, which is the end of violence and war as a means for settling conflict. As a bookseller, he was a pioneer in the paperback revolution, creating one of the most influential bookstores in the country. He was selling affordable paperbacks in an inviting and intellectually stimulating atmosphere here in Menlo Park. And because of his activism and a lot of tolerance for people and ideas, the bookstore reflected the times, becoming ground zero for many young idealists, intellectuals, radicals, and families alike, all looking for connection, identity, and community. The bookstore touched people's lives in a profound way in really turbulent times. Dad believed that the role of a bookseller was to offer a wide range of ideas, so the inventory was diverse and included works from all sides of the political spectrum. And he believed that in a democracy, people needed to make decisions, and the more informed they were, the better those decisions were. So for many, that meant that Kepler's was their bookstore, and they could discover new ideas or just simply find a place of solace from the real world. For some, that meant that Kepler and his bookstore were dangerous, and for others it meant that it was just a really cool place to go. And I wonder, tonight, how many people here shopped at Kepler's in the 60s and 70s? Wow, that's a lot. Anyone from the 50s? Wow, fantastic, thank you. Yeah. It was really an amazing place. I mean, to go into that store, I can remember back to the 60s at least, and it was in an old warehouse. There were, funky bookshelves that were handmade and paperback books stuffed in them on the walls and even the ceilings. Posters, psychedelic posters. I mean, it was a place to be, and it was just amazing. In the 70s, the bookstore expanded into a auto garage. Maybe some of you remember the old Phillips 66 on the corner of El Camino and I think it was Live Oak. And with the expansion, what you have is this rambling building with tile and concrete floors, the concrete still stained with oil from the garage. My occasional job was to go in the morning and sweep up the dust that had blown in from El Camino the day before, and along with that oftentimes were cigarette butts and maybe other butts that people had stomped out the night before. I mean, it was just amazing, and I really thought about, my joys at Kepler's in so many ways have been hearing the stories of customers as they talk about what Kepler's has meant to them, how it's been a part of their life growing up, and I had the opportunity when I was first working here to talk with long-time customers who were then maybe in their early middle age, and when they found out I was the owner's son, they would get really excited and practically start gushing to me about what Kepler's had meant to them growing up, and tell these stories about coming of age in Kepler's, and to the extent that the detail was often different, the story itself was basically the same theme. People would say, I was young, I was curious, I wanted a place to go, and I had a friend told me about this really cool bookstore where it was amazing to go there, and the books were amazing, and hey, if you went in at certain times, you might see Joan Baez or Jerry Garcia, and they wanted to go in, they'd talk to their parents, and invariably there'd be some authority figure that would tell them, no, don't go there. They would say, my dad told me though, or my rabbi told me, or my principal told me, stay out of Kepler's. It's a dangerous place with dangerous ideas. And I was amazed, and 201, these stories ended with, and so I came in and it changed my life. And really, thank you. That may be my dad's greatest legacy. I mean, that how he led his life and his bookstore changed the lives of others. And I'm just delighted that 57 years later, we're here today to see it continue into the future. So thank you. Thank you for being in.
So there's one more group of people I want to thank before I introduce tonight's author, and that is all of you. Really, the customers of Kepler's. I hope you guys realize what a remarkable community this is. Nowhere else in the country, I don't think anywhere else in the entire world, has something like this happened, where twice this bookstore has come. Once it closed, and second time it came very close to closing. And both the times the community has stepped forward and a very grassroots effort said, no, we are going to do something about it because we still need a good bookstore. There was this remarkable survey that actually Steve Piersanti here, who's the president and founder of Barrett Kohler Publishers, he helped us design and conduct a survey back when the transition effort was starting. And we generally want to know if people still want a bookstore, because newspapers have been writing obituaries of bookstores for a long time, and it was a genuine question. We are very open and open-minded about it, and we want to know, do people still care about a bookstore when everyone, especially in Silicon Valley, is reading books on iPads and Kindles? And 93% of the people who responded to the survey said they value Kepler's as an intellectual and cultural hub, and that's what it means to them. It's much more than a place to buy books. So thank you to all of you who through generations have supported Kepler's and continue to support Kepler's. A big round of applause for all of you. And I hope you'll continue to do that. And we'll try to keep the pace with all the changes that are going on in the marketplace to keep bringing you great books, great authors, and new formats and new mediums. Okay, so now to introduce tonight's author. Michael Doyle is the featured author tonight, and he's a reporter in the Washington, D.C. bureau of the McClatchy newspaper chain, where he covers legal affairs, the courts, like the U.S. Supreme Court and the U.S. Justice Department. He also writes the McClatchy legal affairs blog called Suits and Sentences. Michael is a graduate of Oberlin College and earned a Master of Studies in Law from Yale Law School, where he was a Knight Journalism Fellow. He also earned a Master's in Government from the Johns Hopkins University, and the book he's here to tell us about tonight is Radical Chapters, which is a book about Roy Kepler and the history of Kepler's. And joining Michael in a conversation today, we'll have Kristen Evans, who is the head of store operations for the new Kepler's, the co-owner of the Booksmith, and truly my better half. Kristen started reading this book over the summer as we had just finished the Future Search planning session for Kepler's. And we are trying to explore and learn more about the history of Kepler's, and we just got an advanced copy of this book. So every day we live in the city, and as we are driving back and forth from San Francisco to Kepler, she was reading the book out aloud to me in the car. So she became my audiobook. And those few weeks as she read the entire book to me, it was so deeply influential learning the history of Kepler's and about Roy, that started to influence a lot of things we are doing about bringing back a lot of that community activism spirit, live casting that debate today, the presidential debate. So hopefully you'll see a lot more of those ideas continue to come back. So please join me in welcoming Michael and Kristen to the stage.
Thank you all for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces, and I'm really just so proud to be up here tonight. And so thrilled. I couldn't think of a better book for us to be talking about on the night of the reopening of Kepler's books. It's called Radical Chapters, and if you haven't seen it, it's up towards the front counter, and it's pacifist bookseller Roy Kepler and the Paperback Revolution. Now, Roy, what do you think you would have thought about tonight's debate?
Young Roy or old Roy?
Yeah.
I think young Roy would have set up clocks on both our houses. Young Roy was he was described by the late great Ralph Cohn, who used to manage the store, a fellow pacifist in World War II. Ralph said, "You should have seen Roy back then. He was like a little Brigham Young, full of fire, full of sometimes maybe rigid principle." And I think Roy, as a young man and maybe as a middle-aged man, would have said, these are both war-fighting presidents. We are engaged in a war without end, it seems Roy would say, in the Middle East. We are assassinating people from the air, I think Roy would say, and he might not see a big difference between the two. I think as Roy aged, he took a slightly different, maybe more tolerant perspective of conventional politicians. In 1972, I was surprised to see in his archives a letter written to a friend, and he was talking about George McGovern, a peace candidate, but still a conventional politician. And Roy said to his friend, he was going to do what he could to get McGovern elected. So I think over the course of time, Roy moderated his views and seemed to accept the political system more than he did when he was a fiery young man.
Well, to back up a little bit, what got you interested in writing a biography of Roy?
I used to go to Roy's stores, mostly in Village Corners, which was the Los Altos store, the sort of the younger sibling. Sometimes they felt underappreciated compared to Menlo Park, but it was closer to where I lived in Los Altos. And I just thought it was a great bookstore to start with.
And then there was some tapes that you discovered?
Well, I was going to say that I had the fortune of working for the Palo Alto Weekly in the early 1980s. And I could write about any topic at all under the sun. And I chose to write about Kepler's. They were having an anniversary at the time. And a friend of mine and I went up to Roy's house in Grass Valley. And my friend maintained the tape recorder. And I took the notes. And it resulted in a story. I talked to Clark at that time about